to this, our final panel in the CSWR annual conference, this year's theme, Studying Religion Across the Disciplines. Our panel this morning is entitled Religion, Religious Law, Secular Law. As you can see, we have a fuller panel than we have had for other sessions, with 3 presenters and 2 respondents. So please allow me to begin by introducing our presenters. Our first presenter in the middle is Suzanne Smith. Suzanne is a lecturer in history and literature here at Harvard in the Yard. She teaches in the fields of modern Europe, early modern Europe, medieval Europe, and America. Her recent research focuses particularly on religious pluralism. In 2012, she won the John Clive Teaching Prize for History and Literature. In 2013, she received the Joseph R. Levinson Memorial Teaching Prize from the Undergraduate Council of Harvard College. Great teachers win that, I have to say. I'm expecting a fabulous lecture. Few win that prize. Our second speaker, down at the end, will be George Soroka. George is currently a lecturer in government, and he will received his PhD in political science here just this month, in March 2014, is that right?
That's correct.
Yes, great. Congratulations. Yay. Additionally, he holds a master's in regional studies, focusing on Russian, East Europe, and Central Asia from Harvard, as well as an MA in liturgical studies from Drew University, where he also completed his BA in anthropology and religion. His primary research interests focus on processes of democratization in the post-communist world, the uses and abuses of historical politics in contemporary foreign policy discourses in Eastern Europe, and the intersection between religion and politics in Europe and the United States. Our final presenter today will be Winifred Sullivan, who is professor and chair of the Department of Religious Studies at Indiana University, and also an affiliate professor of law at the Moore School of Law. Professor Sullivan is interested in religion as a broad and complex social and cultural phenomenon that both generates law and is regulated by law. She's trained in law and in religious studies and has taught both in law school and in religion departments. She practiced law for 6 years after graduating from law school before returning to graduate school to study religion, which I always think of in your bio as seeing the light. Professor Sullivan.
Go the other way too.
Professor Sullivan's training in the academic study of religion is in 2 fields: American religious history and the comparative study of religion. Her research interest is primarily in understanding the intersection of religion and law in the U.S. within a broader comparative field, both theoretically and cross-culturally. Within legal studies, her work falls broadly within socio-legal and critical legal studies. She is the author of 3 books analyzing legal discourses about religion, primarily in the context of actions brought to enforce the religion clauses of the First Amendment and related legislation. Our 2 PhD student respondents are to my left. The first will be Deirdre de Bruin-Rubio. Deirdre is a PhD candidate here at the Committee on the Study of Religion. Her dissertation uses ethnographic methods to study interfaith organizations in France and the United States. She's particularly interested in Christian-Muslim relations, secularism and laïcité, and the concept of pluralism. Our final respondent will be Adam Lyons. Adam is also a PhD student in the Committee on the Study of Religion, studying Japanese religions and law. His dissertation will deal with prison chaplaincy in Japan. Before coming to Harvard, he worked as an assistant to the Georgia Capitol Defender, defending people on death row. So please join me in welcoming both our panelists and our respondents, and we'll begin with Professor Smith.
Good morning, and thank you so much for inviting me to this wonderful event, and thank you, Lexi, for making the preparation for this a pleasure with very friendly and supportive emails. I'm talking today about religious law and something I'm calling the visual secular. And any help you can give me in defining the latter would be much appreciated. Of the giving of the law at Sinai depicted in the Hebrew Bible, the history of Western art does not lack for images. Throughout early modernity, representations of religious law in this context
commonly amounted to representations of the Mosaic law described in the book of Exodus. A good number of the images of Moses holding the tablets of the law and breaking them assign a prominent role to the actual tablets themselves, which are variously shown with letters engraved in Hebrew, in Latin, in vernacular languages, and occasionally with no lettering at all. Yet perhaps the best known work of art associated with Mosaic law and Western art, Michelangelo's Moses, which figures prominently on the wall tomb of Pope Julius II in the Church of San Pietro in Vincoli, shows us next to nothing of the actual tablets and nothing whatsoever of the words engraved on them. They are tucked rather inconspicuously at the side of the lawgiver. Given their peripheral status, it's not entirely surprising that modern viewers of this sculpture have tended to focus on the lawgiver rather than the tablets of the law, and the status of the words engraved upon them in Judaism and Christianity. This is especially the case for those viewers who have read Freud's 1914 essay, The Moses of Michelangelo. In looking at the statue, and we're not looking at the statue. Okay. So here's Rembrandt, and you can see it's in Hebrew. This is Latin. I asked a friend of mine who's a Latinist to translate that for me, and he said it was too degraded to translate. So if anyone could translate that, that would be great. You can see that this artist has helpfully translated the Hebrew into French and reduced it to basically don't sin and love people. You can see here the law is blank, which creates all kinds of opportunities. There's the Hebrew, Latin, French, vernacular, and blank. Okay, here's Moses. Now we're looking at the statue. So given the peripheral status of the tablets, it's not entirely surprising that modern viewers of the sculpture have tended to focus on the lawgiver, who, as you can see, is quite imposing, rather than the tablets of the law and the status of the words engraved upon them in Judaism and Christianity. This is especially the case for those viewers who have read Freud's 1914 essay, The Moses of Michelangelo. In looking at the statue, what compels our immediate attention, if we're guided by Freud, is the supposed inward crisis that has arisen for Moses in the course of dealing with those to whom the law was given. There's the tablets. You can see that it's more compelling because he looks upset. The law itself figures as accoutrement, background, or prelude to that dilemma. Moses' crisis in Freud's account doesn't involve any attempt to invoke the party who was ostensibly responsible for getting him into his vexing predicament in the first place, namely God, or indeed any recognizably religious issues of which we might speak. Yet Michelangelo's Moses for Freud is still, quote, more than human. He is, however, explicitly not the Moses of sacred texts and religious traditions. This is a passage from Freud's essay. Michelangelo has placed a different Moses on the tomb of the Pope, one superior to the historical or traditional Moses. He's modified the theme of the broken tables. He does not let Moses break them in his wrath, but makes him be influenced by the danger that they will be broken and makes him calm that wrath, or at any rate, prevent it from becoming an act. In this way, he adds something new and more than human to the figure of Moses, so that the giant frame, look back at the giant frame, with its tremendous physical power, becomes only a concrete expression of the highest mental achievement that is possible to man, that of struggling successfully against an inward passion for the sake of a cause to which he had devoted himself. The praise of self-mastery achieved under pressure, of course, is scarcely limited to sacred texts associated with particular religious traditions or with religion more generally. Nietzsche's supermen, for example, are found precisely where the highest resistance is constantly overcome. The Übermensch is notable for his capacity to organize the chaos of his passions, sublimate his impulses, and give style to his character. According to Freud, the self-mastery shown by the sculpted Moses reflects Michelangelo's comparable achievement with respect to his own passions. The artist, he suggests, was a person of vigorous passions who carved his Moses on the Pope's tomb as a warning to himself, thus in self-criticism. Of Freud's Moses, we might be tempted to say that he is of secular as well as religious significance. But how do we know that? When we encounter something that we take to be secular in the visual arts, or more broadly in visual experience, on what basis do we assign secularity to the person, event, or phenomenon being represented? In short, what do we look for when we look for the secular? I'm specifically interested in these questions with reference to the representation of religious law. How have various artists envisioned what I shall call the visual secular in the context of representations of religious law? Here, I can't offer more than an attempt to approach this question with reference to a few works of art. In doing so, I shall seek to open up questions about the visual secular as it pertains to law and religion. And my second indirect objective is to suggest the usefulness of works of visual art in the study of religion and law across the disciplines. And I've just finished advising 3 senior theses in different areas on art, and it actually works. But before pursuing these objectives, however, I shall briefly consider some broad questions about the representation of religious and secular phenomena, as well as religion itself. In keeping with the oft-noted attempt to define the secular in terms of the absence of religion, one might be tempted to answer the question of what does the secular look like in visual representations of religious law with it looks like what is not religious. For example, with reference to Michelangelo's Moses, we might say that he's not represented in such a way as to localize the meaning of the sculpture within a given religious tradition or within religion more generally, whatever that means. For Freud, what one needs to read Moses correctly are Western ideas about the psychology of self-mastery. Although he does not note the origin of such ideas, they're both religious and secular. Prior to late modernity, religion itself was almost always imagined in Western art as a female figure situated in relation to something that she is not. Okay, there's religion. Take, for instance, Titian's Religion Secured by Spain. This painting was presented by Titian to King Philip II to commemorate the victory of Spain over the Turks at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. In preparing the painting for Philip, Titian drew from a composition featuring the goddesses Minerva and Venus. So he basically converted Minerva, this was Minerva, into Spain. He had the painting basically lying around the studio and put it to use. So Minerva becomes Spain and Venus becomes religion. The latter is shown all but naked, save for a blue cloth draped over her hips and one of her legs. And she's in a state of apparent distress. She's holding her hand to her breast while sitting on a rock with her gaze cast downward. Who is religion here? Our most immediate impression is that she's defined by her need to be rescued by Spain. When religion is not represented in explicit relation to others from whom she requires assistance, she's sometimes depicted in relation to those whom she is overthrowing or offering rebuke. So here she's offering rebuke to a naval hero, and I haven't been able to figure out what the naval hero actually did wrong to deserve this rebuke, but anyway, he's getting rebuked. And here's religion overthrowing heresy and hatred, who looks like it's really a successful overthrow. And they're stressed. In turning to more contemporary art, however, one finds strikingly, and I really looked for this, almost no representations of religion in relation to a specific other. More frequently, one finds religion and religious experience invoked in such a way that they can't be represented through figuration, much less seen in relation to anything else, unless perhaps absence or negation may be said themselves to constitute anything else. One thinks, for example, of a recent painting by Dutch artist Jess Fomsgaard entitled No Religion. There's no religion. What do we see when we are implicitly told, as we are by the title, that religion is not present or ought not to be in what we are seeing or apart from that? Here we see something vaguely suggestive of a rendering of an ancient city as drawn from above. And one might profitably compare this painting with a schematic plan of the city of Pisidian Antioch. And this city was decimated in the 8th century, so I guess none of us have been there. In that plan, we see 2 churches, 1 basilica, 1 nymphaeum, and a temple of Augustus. I think the temple of Augustus is the big one. Yeah, it is. Reflecting various layers of the city's religious history. In the painting, there are, in fact, 7 temples or civic structures of some sort, but it's not clear which ones, if any, serve religious functions or what those functions might be. And of the various temple-like edifices, and I did find that these black rectangles show up in all the architectural things, so I think that was pretty clearly what he had in mind. None is represented as being more prominent than another, although arguably this one could contend for prominence. We see here no single religion, but perhaps material evidence of the existence of several, or in fact none. Where is religion in this? Has it been absorbed into what it is not, whatever that may be? In the context of modern art, of course, one occasionally finds the suggestion that artistic experience itself is a mode of religious experience, or perhaps the mode of religious experience, the only one that's left. For example, modern artist Mark Rothko famously remarked that I'm interested in the basic human emotions, and which he interestingly defines as tragedy, ecstasy, and doom. The people who weep before my pictures are having the same religious experience I had when I painted them. In this conception, art as such is that which is conceived and received in terms of religious experience. Religious experience, in turn, is associated with weeping and other heightened states of emotion, as well as an elusive sense of higher meaning, meaning something of more than mundane significance, something that is, in Freud's terms from the essay on Michelangelo, more than human. But as Freud reminds us in his reading of Michelangelo's Moses, this something more may connote secular overcoming from within, rather than a distinctively religious encounter with the source of transcendence, external to the self, from without, as it were. The reconceptualization of art as that which takes the place of religious experience runs flatly counter to conceptions of modern art as that which is more akin to philosophy and science than it is to religion. The most well-known formulation of this notion is found in art critic Clement Greenberg's highly influential essay of 1960 entitled Modernist Painting. According to Greenberg, the essence of modern art is its capacity for self-criticism. In this, he suggests modern art is antithetical to religion. Modernism, as such, in his account, has no place for the latter. One is alive, the other is dead. And here's the quote from Greenberg. Modernism includes more than art and literature. By now, it covers almost the whole of what is truly alive in our culture. It happens, however, to be very much of a historical novelty. Western civilization is not the first civilization to turn around and question its own foundations, but it's the one that's gone the farthest in doing so. I identify modernism with the intensification of this self-critical tendency that began with the philosopher Kant. The essence of modernism lies, as I see it, in the use of characteristic methods of a discipline to criticize the discipline itself, not in order to subvert it, but to entrench it more firmly in its area of competence. For Greenberg, modernist self-criticism derives and differs from the mode of self-criticism that he takes to be characteristic of 18th century Enlightenment thought. At that time, he suggests, a more rational justification had begun to be demanded of every formal activity, and Kantian self-criticism, which had arisen in philosophy in answer to this demand in the first place, was called on eventually to meet and interpret it in areas that lay far from philosophy. Foremost amongst the areas that Greenberg sees as having been constitutionally deaf to the demand for rational justification and self-criticism is religion. We know, he confidently asserts, what has happened to an activity like religion, which could not avail itself of Kantian criticism in order to justify itself. What we know, apparently, according to Greenberg, is that religion has been reduced to entertainment, and entertainment in turn to therapy. In Greenberg's account, this fate was warded off by the arts, because in answering the demand of modernity for critical distance from itself, it demonstrated that the kind of experience the arts provide is valuable in its own right and not to be obtained from any other kind of activity. The arts, in other words, could still be, in Greenberg's word, pure, with pure meaning unique and possessed of self-definition. To his mind, then, modernist art belongs to the same specific cultural tendency as modern science. This, he suggests, is of the highest significance as a historical fact. I'm not sure how he's defining historical fact there. A number of problems exist with Greenberg's account of the emergence of an untainted modernism out of the muck of an impure therapeutic culture, which I do not have the space to detail here. What is striking for our purposes about Greenberg's account of Western culture is his suggestion of a movement which was not taken by religion, i.e. the movement toward self-criticism, within religion, which would have allowed religion, after the fashion of modern art, to define and justify itself as religion. And this movement of self-criticism in which he's interested ostensibly allows a given entity to, quote unquote, turn around and question its foundations, to step back from within itself, as it were, and become a question to itself. In the last sentence, I've deliberately and conspicuously used terms borrowed from the language of questioning oneself, characteristic of Augustinian introspection, as well as a description of the crucial gesture entailed in gaining explicitly theoretical distance from experience or phenomena. What exactly is entailed in the capacity to step back from a given state of mind or affairs and to gain the distance that is the condition of criticism of it or mastery over that state? Under what conditions, if any, may a movement toward self-criticism, or the movement that is self-criticism, take place collectively? And what are its sources? For Freud, the source of Moses' successful act of self-criticism, as well as that of Michelangelo himself, is an assertion of will on behalf of a cause to which he's devoted himself. At issue is not the cause itself, whether noble or ignoble, but passionate devotion to that cause, which entails personal commitment. But Freud's own insight into the meaning of the putative accomplishment of Moses and Michelangelo alike is ostensibly born not of an assertion of will, but of an interpretation guided by psychoanalytic theory. While at one point in his account, Freud found himself overwhelmed by the statue of Moses, he was, with the aid of his theoretical equipment, ultimately able to gain enough distance from it to see it for what it was. That was quite a feat, Freud suggests, given the effect of this quote-unquote inscrutable and wonderful statue upon him. And let me go back to Moses so we can see how inscrutable and wonderful it is. Okay, there it is. This is what Freud has to say about Moses. How often have I mounted the steep steps from the unlovely Corso Cavour to the lonely piazza where the deserted church stands, and essayed to support the angry scorn of the hero's glance. Sometimes I have crept cautiously out of the half-gloom of the interior, as though I myself belonged to the mob, which can hold fast to no conviction, which has neither faith nor patience, and which rejoices when it has regained its illusory idols. Freud mentally inserts himself into the mob of golden calf worshippers at Sinai and withdraws himself from the mob in one sentence. Having denounced them, he asks himself why it is that he still finds Michelangelo's Moses to be so extraordinarily inscrutable and awe-inspiring, given that there is, he notes, not the slightest doubt that it represents Moses, the lawgiver of the Jews. It's not the authority of Jewish law against idolatry that informs Freud's rejection of the mob, but rather, he suggests, his quote-unquote rationalistic or perhaps analytic turn of mind, which led him to develop a theory of psychoanalysis. That theory, in turn, allows him to zero in on Moses as a heroic figure of self-mastery and to interpret that demonstration of self-mastery. The law as such is not much of an issue in his interpretation, but through the act of interpreting, he secures his distance from the mob of rejoicing idolaters. Thus far, we've taken note of three sorts of self-critical disengagement, each manifesting itself as a mode of mastery. The first is that detected by Freud in the sculpted figure of Moses, the second, that detected by Freud in Michelangelo, and the third, that of Freud himself. All three of these have a single source. They all follow from Freud's own turn toward interpretation, as facilitated by his use of theory and prompted by his rationalistic turn of mind. That turn of mind is the impetus for his initial attempt to disengage from received ideas, whether those of idolaters or merely of scholars who, while not mob-like, did not go far enough in interpreting the sculpture. Theory is the means through which he asserts and expands his distance. In pointing toward this moment of self-critical disengagement, have we located what it is that we look for when we look for the secular? Or is the understanding of theoretically informed criticism as that which promises privileged access to the extraordinary itself suggestive, as Habermas indicates in another context, of religion? Is the visual secular a stance that can be recognized in any historical context, whether we encounter it in an Italian sculpture or a 20th century scholarly essay? In commenting on this moment's putative origins, are we pointing toward the origins of the secular, at least in its capacity as a particular cast of mind? Is theory, in fact, the parent, or at least the distant ancestor of the secular? And if so, what does this have to do with religious law? In his last book, the late sociologist of religion, Robert Bellah, links the capacity for stepping back from experience to the attainment of specifically theoretical distance. In his account, the capacity to theorize arose at a particular moment, namely during the first millennium BCE. During that time, Bellah observes theoretic culture emerges in several places in the Old World, questioning the old narratives and their mimetic bases, rejecting ritual and myth as it creates new rituals and myths, and calling all the old hierarchies into question in the name of ethical and spiritual universalism. The dawn of theory, in Bellah's account, marks an axis shift in human evolution. In a well-known essay from 1975, Benjamin Schwartz described the characteristic gesture of this period as entailing, quote, a kind of standing back and looking beyond, a kind of critical, reflective questioning of the actual, and a new vision of what lies beyond. The movements which entail this gesture, in Schwartz's rather capacious account of it, include Abraham's departure from Ur and all that it represents, the Buddha's more radical renunciation, Confucius's search for the Zen within, the Lao Tse's books strain toward the nameless Tao, and by the Greek strain toward an order beyond the Homeric gods, by the Socratic search, and by the Orphic mysteries. So that's a lot. Schwartz suggests, somewhat problematically, I think, that what is common to all these is a strain toward transcendence. This transcendence may be either secular or religious, but it's definitively neither. What is at stake, apparently, in the act of transcending is the capacity of a given figure or tradition to stand back from and see beyond its current state by practicing critical questioning. Transcendence does for Schwartz, in other words, what theory does for Bella. And as I've noted elsewhere, Bella treats the rise of Mosaic and Deuteronomic law in ancient Israel as a phenomenon that fits comfortably within the shift toward theoretic culture. He actually tries to make rhetoric and law sort of serve as stunt doubles for theory, which is not especially convincing in my view, but anyway, tries to work it out. He does not spell out their relationship at any length. Like theory, however, law entails an attempt formally to articulate, often through procedural means, some distance from a given phenomenon in order to judge it. Broadly speaking, both theory and law pertain to the articulation and maintenance of space within which judgment of different sorts, whether critical or legal, may occur. But legal judgment may, in certain contexts, depend upon or reinforce received opinions, customs, normative principles, and traditions rather than departing from them. Precedent, principle, including that ostensibly derived from a higher law, or tradition may be part of the legal grounds upon which a given critique is corrected or rejected altogether. And those principles, one thinks, for instance, of the principle of human dignity, which is obviously transnational, as it has been invoked in recent legal contexts in national bodies of law. And that principles of markedly ambiguous religious and secular parentage. Generally speaking, leaving aside for the moment the problematic question of the boundaries between quote-unquote religious and secular law, law, unlike theory, tends to be attached to sanctions, commands, and a set of means, sometimes violent, by which those sanctions are to be implemented. For the person who obeys the law, it may also entail reverence or love, both of which connote a felt sense of obligation or duty. It's certainly the case in terms of ordinary experience that laws are more like maxims or imperatives than they are like arguments. Traffic or tax laws, for example, are not presented to us in the course of ordinary experience as invitations to practice critical thinking with respect to them and ask probing questions. The imperative do this or negative consequences will ensue is one moment in the life of the law, and the carrying out of those consequences is another. But there's also, I think, a moment of inward stepping back with respect to the giving or the living of the law. And this is the moment of conscience in both its secular and religious formulations. It's also the moment in which the supposed tension between the letter and the spirit of the law has been thought to surface, and in which the former, i.e. the letter, may be rewritten in favor of the latter, namely the spirit. And I think we see a sort of letter and spirit tension here. So basically, the literal words have been rewritten in terms of what Claude Vignon wants to say is the essential spirit of them. My very large question which I can't do more than ask in this context, is in what ways has this moment of distancing that we've been talking about function differently, if in fact it does function differently, with regard to religious and secular law? Before turning to this question, it's worth noting that we seem to have encountered a problem in that the moment of critical distance that we've been singling out as a potential marker of the visual secular upon reflection, as well as some consideration of Bella and Schwartz, turns out to be possibly, though not necessarily, consistent with quote-unquote religious modes of transcendence. What are we to make of this? Is not critical self-questioning and criticism the special province of modern secularism? It's not an accident that the act of critical self-questioning follows, that is associated with secularism. So as Wendy Brown, Judith Butler, and Saba Mahmood have noted, the assumption that critique is secular implies that secularism entails an active critique of an object or way of thinking, as well as creating the very atmosphere in which intellectual positions are open to criticism. And yet, it's not only modern criticism that may speak of and account for the putative moment in which one steps back or walks away from a given position. This moment has been canvassed in works of art as well, albeit in different terms. So we've already mentioned Freud's attempt to read Michelangelo's Moses in this light, and I want to conclude by looking at some representations of religious law in painting. Okay, shifting gears a little bit. At the outset of this paper, I noted that Western art doesn't lack for images of giving of the law. It does, however, lack for images of living with the law, and particularly Jewish law. This isn't surprising. Apart from Rembrandt, there are very few representations of Jewish traditions in Western art. But Marc Chagall, if we look a little bit outside the European tradition, is one of the figures who has dealt with them. There is, of course, some doubt about whether Chagall is a major artist. Clement Greenberg, not very charitably, says he's figures in the history of art as a painter of at least the second rank. Greenberg suggests that Chagall his work was softened and sweetened by the practice of that cuisine of viscous oil, which incorporates from the essence of French tradition. And he brings up as a counter to Chagall and his supposed viscosity, Chaim Soutine. And he basically says Soutine is the one who captured Jewishness because he's, quote, more naive and direct and absorbed, less self-conscious, and more involved with his feelings. He looks away from himself, and he looks to trees, fields, flowers, animals, houses, and people. So for Jewishness in art, in this account, is revealed through artless absorption rather than self-criticism. But in any event, it's Chagall, not Soutine, who wants to think about Jewish law in terms of the visual secular. And just very briefly, Chagall grew up in a Hasidic family, but he stopped observing when he was 13 years old. And I want to suggest that his ambivalence about Jewish law shows up in his paintings. Over and over, he returns to a figure I call the man on his way out. He shows up in quite a few paintings, often near the edges of the painting, but sometimes in the center, with his feet directed out of the space of the painting, as it were. And he never quite leaves, however. He represents the decision or the need to depart from a given context. And there's a number of paintings where we can see the man on his way out. There he is at the bottom. Here he is here. And Chagall is particularly interested in how this figure functions in terms of religious observance. This is our last image. For my purposes, the figure of the man on his way out takes on an added level of meaning in Chagall's Feast Day, or Rabbi with Citron. This painting represents a rabbi on the autumnal feast day of Sukkot. The rabbi is carrying an etrog and lulav in deference to Jewish law, and just above his head, another rabbi, also draped in a prayer shawl, plays the role of the man on his way out in miniature. And the miniature rabbi, as you can see, is not carrying his ceremonial appurtenances. Earlier in this paper, I mentioned the imperative moment of the life of the law and suggested that there is in law a moment as well of an inward stepping back. Freud's interest in this moment, as it figures in the life of Moses, all but writes the law out of the conflict altogether in favor of a drama of wayward passions. The tablets of the law remain intact in Freud's rewriting the biblical narrative at the cost of becoming peripheral to the scene. For Chagall, however, painting his feast day in 1914, the same year that Freud published his essay on Moses, the visual secular is not a moment of more than human triumph. If the miniature rabbi does suggest to us a moment of the visual secular, it may be nothing more or less than a fragile, contingent, or fugitive moment of experience. It may suggest an alternative reservoir of meaning, or perhaps even a decided turn of mind tethered to reflection. It would require some imagination, however, to understand that turn of mind, apart from the larger figure on which it rests. Here the man on his way out seems to be stepping away from observance, from within observance. Relative to the larger rabbi, we might be tempted to view the miniature one as the more secular figure. But if the figures were not juxtaposed as they are, how could we tell?
Professor Soroka, you're next.
I have some images too, but I'm embarrassed to show them after those beautiful slides. Mine are decidedly lowbrow, as you'll see. Could we just... okay. So, I begin by asking, what is blasphemy? This is probably the one audience that I don't need to pose the definition to, but I will anyway. That particular definition is taken from the March 2014 policy brief for the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Blasphemy, and more broadly, hate speech laws dealing with religion, which in their turn can be thought of as acts expressing contempt for God or things held sacred by others, are in tension with human rights protections and liberalisms. There's a broad-based consensus on this, that such laws are problematic with regard to human rights standards. Let me cite a few examples. Articles 18 and 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR. This is a multilateral treaty adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1966 and in force from March 1976, signed by most states in the world and virtually all of the Western world. Article 18 protects the freedoms of individuals to free thought, conscience, and religion, with the limitations on this only allowed to protect public safety, order, health, morals, or the fundamental rights and freedoms of others. Similarly, Article 19 maintains, and I'm quoting, "Everyone shall have the right to hold opinions without interference," and protects freedom of expression, including, again quoting, "freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers." And again, caveats on this are very narrow. They're only allowed to respect the rights and reputations of others and for reasons of national security, order, and public health or morals. Incidentally, this language mirrors very closely, almost word for word, language found in the European Convention on Human Rights, the ECHR, which was ratified in 1953. Similarly, there exist numerous UN resolutions in the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly. One of these is the General Comment number 34, Article 19, paragraph 48, in case you were interested. This dates from 2011, and I'm just going to quote this to you, because I think, you'll forgive me for reading some of this, but I think it's important to get a flavor of the language, and you'll hopefully see where I'm going with this in a few minutes. Again, quoting, "Prohibitions on displays of lack of respect for a religion or other belief system, including blasphemy laws, are incompatible with the covenant," meaning the ICCPR, "except under very specific circumstances laid out in Article 20.2, quoting, any advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence shall be prohibited by law." But regardless of the circumstances, it's deemed not permissible to have laws preventing or punishing criticism of religious leaders or commentary on religious doctrine and tenets of faith. All right. There are a number of other such documents. I'm not going to read all of them to you, but please know that they do exist. One of the most interesting, incidentally, was the last one here. It's the Venice Commission report, which dates from 2008. It's the Venice Commission was charged with examining this question of blasphemy and whether these laws were compatible with human rights, broadly defined. So they not only examined traditional blasphemy laws, but they examined hate speech laws, they examined incitement to hatred laws, and other manifestations of what have sometimes been called neo-blasphemy laws. Okay. But I just told you that a number of organizations, international organizations, supranational organizations, have said that this is problematic. And the recommendation on the whole has generally been not favorable. Most of the recommendations coming out of places like the Venice Commission, the Council of Europe, have suggested that the abolishment of blasphemy laws and neo-blasphemy laws is a good thing, or at least tightening up the wording in these laws dealing with hate speech and so forth would be very good, because as we'll talk about shortly, the wording tends to be rather sloppy and very open-ended in a lot of these. I've just told you that, but let's look at the percentage of countries in the world with penalties for blasphemy, apostasy, or defamation of religion. This is from a Pew study of 2011. Out of the 198 countries studied, 47% penalize blasphemy, apostasy, or defamation. Let's break this down a little bit further. 16% have blasphemy laws on the books, 10% have laws against apostasy, 44% have laws against the defamation of religion, which includes, incidentally, hate speech against members of religious groups. And some countries have multiple laws to this effect. So if you look at the Pew study, you'll see that the totals exceed 100 because of these multiple laws being in effect. The regional breakdown is here. Now, we may say we're not so surprised about the Middle East or maybe sub-Saharan Africa having these laws, but look at Europe. 18% of European countries have blasphemy laws, and Pew adopts a fairly strict definition of this. And fully 80% have defamation of religion laws. But we should be aware that, well, we should be a bit circumspect about these statistics. In many cases, Western European countries have legacy laws that are still on the books that are rarely, if ever, used. And even the more recent neo-blasphemy laws dealing with incitement to hatred and hate speech, and again, we'll talk more about these shortly, are often selectively enforced, depending on political mood and or circumstance. Nonetheless, it's still interesting, I think, to note the pervasiveness of these restrictions. And just as a complete aside, because this was news to me, I found this out a few days ago, I'll also mention that you should sometime look at the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Statute 272, Section 36 and 38. We still have very Christian-centric anti-blasphemy laws in this state. Also, we should be aware that blasphemy is interpreted and defined in many ways. According to the definition employed by the Venice Commission report from 2008, only 8 European states have true blasphemy laws on the books. These states are Austria, Denmark, Finland, Greece, Italy, Liechtenstein, the Netherlands. I should add, Netherlands just repealed their law in December of 2013, and San Marino. However, since the report was published, Ireland has also added a new blasphemy law in 2010 that comports to the strict definition laid out in the Venice Commission report. So we're back to 8. But I want to observe something. The 2011 Pew study also found 8 European countries with blasphemy laws, but their list was slightly different because they used a different methodology to determine what constitutes blasphemy. Their list consisted of Denmark, Germany, Greece, Ireland, Italy, Malta, the Netherlands, again, repealed 2013, and Poland. With the exception of Ireland and the Netherlands, this does not appear to be the result of a change in the laws, but rather in how they are understood. So the penalty for blasphemy in these countries is generally a term of imprisonment and or a monetary fine. Nonetheless, as the Venice Commission report makes clear, insulting religious feeling or sensibilities is illegal in many more countries. And again, these laws are generally not very tightly worded, which often makes defining such neo-blasphemy laws and distinguishing them from more traditional blasphemy laws quite difficult. A basic rule of thumb, I think that's useful, is that the former are typically designed to protect individuals while the latter are geared towards protecting religious organizations and institutions. So 21 Council of Europe member states have specific laws concerning this. They are Andorra, Cyprus, Croatia, the Czech Republic, Denmark, Spain, Finland, Germany, Greece, Iceland, Italy, Lithuania, Norway, the Netherlands, Poland, Portugal, the Russian Federation, Slovakia, Switzerland, Turkey, and Ukraine. Of these, 7 are post-communist states. But wait, it gets more complicated. 45 of the 47 Council of Europe member states, excluding Andorra and San Marino, make it an offense to incite hatred, with religious hatred a subset of the broader hatred law. For example, dealing with racial and ethnic hatred, that would be an example of this broader hatred law that I just mentioned. Of these 45, only Georgia, Malta, Slovakia, and Macedonia do not specifically include religion under this rubric. The Pew study, meanwhile, using their in-house methodology, finds 36 European countries with laws penalizing the defamation of religion, of which 16 are post-communist states. However, it's difficult to say anything more specific about these latter laws, as there are considerable measurement differences, I think, as you've gathered by now, between the two reports. Let me just skip ahead a little. So, what's sometimes useful to me in thinking about this is to put together a typology, these sorts of questions, I mean. So, this is what I've done. Right now, we're dealing with basically 5 sorts of laws we see in Europe. Actually, I'll keep myself honest, only 4. So traditional blasphemy laws obviously prohibit causing insult to the dominant religion, including the denial of its central faith tenets. This would be something like denying the virgin birth, if you're a Christian. Such laws were designed not to protect individuals, but rather religious institutions from questioning or criticism. The idea was not to safeguard minority rights, but rather to preserve the status quo. Anti-apostasy laws. No longer a problem in Europe. Skip ahead. Defaming or attacking religion as an institution seems quite similar to traditional blasphemy laws, but 2 caveats here are in order. This subset of laws emphasizes questioning the probity of the institution rather than the veracity of its claims. For example, claiming Islam is an innately violent religion, as in the case of the Dutch politician Geert Wilders, versus making claims about Islam's truth claims. Just to give you an example that's come up repeatedly since 1999, the UN has over and over debated draft resolutions brought before it on behalf of the 57-member state Organization of the Islamic Conference, which has sought to prohibit the defamation of Islam. This and the following category are what I refer to as neo-blasphemy laws. Okay, our 4th category, speech offending the sensibilities of religious believers. Okay, already something very interesting has happened here. This is a new subset of laws, ironically arising from the liberal turn in post-war Europe. Here the critical distinction is that it's not the religious institution that is disrespected, but the religious believer, whether individual or group. And the final category is the most problematic. It's similar to category 4, but it requires not just offense to be given, but also that the speech rise to the level of actively discriminating against or even inciting violence against religious believers. In Western Europe, these last 2 categories are often used to attempt to protect minorities from public abuse. This is an inversion of the intent of traditional blasphemy laws. And here I really want to stress that while laws falling into this last category can and have been repeatedly used to stifle free expression, they do not, on the whole, in my opinion, fit neatly with the prior 4 categories, particularly when the actions they cover are clear incitements to violence. All right. So I finally, 15 minutes into this, got to my research questions. So here's my puzzle, okay? We know that all these organizations are recommending doing away with such laws, or at least being very careful in wording them and applying them. Why in the world do so many post-communist countries have these laws on the books? Either traditional blasphemy laws or more commonly these laws against incitement of religious hatred. This is a puzzle. These states were officially atheist in the case of most of the Soviet core states for 70-some years, case of most of the non-core Soviet Warsaw Pact states, 40-some years. 2.5 decades after the Soviet Union collapsed, why are we seeing these states becoming increasingly vocal about implementing and enforcing such laws? Likewise, why have such restrictions appeared in both highly secularized states, such as the Czech Republic, by all standard measures that social scientists, political scientists use, one of, if not the most secularized states in the world? I believe the last World Values Survey showed that something on the order of 38% of Czechs responded that they believe in God, okay? And more traditionally religious states, such as Poland, one of the most, by all traditional measures, church attendance, belief in doctrinal tenets of the Catholic faith, one of the most religious countries in Europe, where the vast majority are not only believers in God, but actually practitioners of their religion. And obviously, in these countries, unlike in Western Europe, the idea of legacy laws that have just been left on the books doesn't hold water. These laws were all crafted after the fall of communism, so there must have been a reason for this. I'm also interested in what sorts of restrictions on freedom of expression concerning religion they impose, as well as why do they adopt specific legal configurations and at whose behest, what circumstances. In other words, who can bring prosecution? Is it just the state that can bring prosecution against individuals or groups? Can other individuals bring up people for prosecution? How selectively are these laws applied? Finally, and I think this is quite interesting because this gets to something political scientists right now are very interested in. It's this idea of international norms diffusion. So do differences exist between EU and non-EU member states? In other words, does learning take place? Does some sort of cultural convergence take place in a political sense? All right. A disclaimer, this is part of a larger and ongoing research project. I've actually just started it quite recently. I had nothing better to do after finishing my dissertation on totally unrelated subjects, so I jumped into this. So I'm not really at a point yet where I can definitively answer all of these questions, but bearing this in mind, I'm going to discuss some preliminary results for Poland and Russia and offer some contextualizing vignettes, if you'll permit me. Okay, so let's put some hypotheses on the screen. Why might these laws be imposed or utilized? Well, one big one that's been advanced in the literature is this idea of using these laws to avoid societal conflict, especially in pluralistic societies. This is a pragmatic approach, either applied in religiously divided societies or alternately societies where religious beliefs are very strong and would be threatened by counterpoised arguments. Diffusion of international norms, what I just mentioned. To me, this is a particularly interesting hypothesis. Did EU membership, for example, prompt post-communist member states to adopt legislation similar to that extent among earlier EU member states? Reversion to post-communist patterns. In the post-communist world, in political life, we know that the interwar, meaning between World War I and World War II, political institutions have been replicated in the post-communist period with an eerie regularity. I'm not sure anyone's actually offered a great answer for why that's happened, but it has. I call this the Rip Van Winkle pattern. It assumes communism was, as Francois Furet once alluded to, an illusion that finally passed and allowed the resumption of European business as usual. This is what political scientists would term, forgive me, I am a political scientist, so I have to embrace my jargon. We would term this historical, institutionalist, and path-dependent account, all right? Rip Van Winkle. Thank you. And finally, there is the active agents scenario. So you have a strong agent advocacy, either church-led, politician-led, or grassroots. Note that none of these modes of behavior have to be exclusionary. It's quite conceivable outcomes result from multiple factors working in unison or from synergistic effects. All right. Russia and Poland are actually two very interesting cases to compare, because among all the post-communist states, They're about as different as one can get. Russia was at the center of the Soviet Empire, while Poland was outside the Soviet core. Russia is today a neo-authoritarian backslider in terms of regime type. It's accurately described by the term competitive authoritarian, meaning there is some political competition and elections are not a mere formality, but what competition does exist does not take place on an equal playing field. The Putin government musters considerable, what they call euphemistically, administrative resources, and controls much of what happens in public life. And as recent events in Ukraine have shown, Russia is increasingly isolating itself internationally and looking less to the west than to the east. Poland, meanwhile, is a consolidated liberal democracy with free and fair, if very rancorous, elections and a thriving civil society. Moreover, it's a member of both NATO and the European Union, placing it firmly in the European club. Furthermore, post-World War II Poland is ethnically homogeneous, with 97% of citizens identifying as Polish, and incidentally, these statistics are all from the CIA World Factbook, and 90% as Catholic with a big C, out of which it's estimated about 75% are actual practicing Catholics. The Roman Catholic Church in Poland is a strong and generally respected institution, having represented an alternative center of legitimacy during the communist period and having taken active part in the Solidarity movement, which eventually brought down the old regime in 1989. Russia, in contrast, is more diverse. 78% of citizens are ethnic Russians, but only 15 to 20% are practicing Orthodox Christians. If you look at the actual number of people who attend church on a weekly basis, we're talking 2 to 3%, depending whose survey you believe. But this is survey after survey has shown this for 2 decades now. But an interesting phenomena takes place in Russia. About 80% of the people identify as Orthodox. Well, this is not a religious identification, this is a cultural identification. And it has very different meanings for politics, which I don't have time to get into, but it's quite fascinating. So the church, the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia, like in Poland with the Catholic Church, is closely tied to national identity, but its political clout is quite constrained, and its institutional legacy, unlike in Poland, is marked by numerous instances of collaboration with the communist regime. And as I mentioned, the cultural image of Orthodoxy, so being Orthodox in Russia, does not seem to influence voting patterns, unlike in Catholic Poland. Incidentally, though, neither country has an official state church, though in practice, de facto, they effectively function as state churches in both those countries. All right. These are all the laws pertaining in some way, shape, or form. Oh, that's my lowbrow image. Forgive me. These are all the laws pertaining to blasphemy, restrictions on religious hate speech, incitement to violence, and all those good categories we talked about. I was planning to read them all to you. They consist of about 4 pages. Let's skip that. All right, let's talk a little bit about some Polish prosecutions. This is Doda. Dorota Rabczewska, Polish pop star, Doda Elektroda. She was it's Poland's answer to Britney Spears. She was charged in 2010 for offending religious sensibilities and convicted in 2012 for comments made a year prior when the singer stated she could more easily believe in dinosaurs than the Bible because, I'm quoting, "It's hard to believe in something written by people who drank too much wine and smoked herbal cigarettes." She was fined 5,000 zloty. Exchange rate at the time was about 3 zloty to the dollar. A Warsaw District Court upheld the conviction on appeal the same year. She is in the process of appealing this to the European Court of Human Rights. Her former fiancé, Adam Darski, frontman for the death metal band Behemoth, was finally acquitted of similar charges in September 2014 after a 6-year legal battle which began when he ripped up a Bible on stage during a concert and called the Catholic Church the most murderous cult on the planet. And since the collapse of communism, I could find 8 other Polish criminal cases dealing with defamation of religion or hate speech. Out of those, 3 were people prosecuted for promoting anti-Semitism. The rest were people who insulted the Catholic Church. Or some aspect, it's more broad, some aspect of traditional religious belief, meaning traditional Christian belief. Okay, Russia, same thing. I'm not going to read all these to you. But I'm sure you remember what happened with the Pussy Riot scandal in 2012. Russia has actually been not rewriting the laws. The media actually did an incredible disservice in reporting this. They reported Russia adopts blasphemy law. No, Russia had these laws on the books. What Russia did was severely increase the penalties for a lot of these laws. And you could see this is also a patchwork. This is all over the place, from the Constitution to laws that have been variously amended. This is, when you read about Putin signing the blasphemy law, this is what they're talking about. They're talking specifically about Article 148 and 282, which was, 148 was amended in 2013 and 282 in 2014. And the penalties are quite stiff right now. I mean, years in jail, forced labor, significant fines on the order of 500,000 rubles. Exchange rate is about 30 rubles to the dollar, but for Russians, I mean, for an ordinary Russian, there's no way that they could afford to pay this. All right, I'm really running out of time, so this is Pussy Riot. This is not the punk prayer that was issued from the ambo in front of the iconostasis of Christ the Savior Cathedral in Moscow. This, I believe, was taken after they were released, although I could be wrong about that. But let me say a few quick words about Russia. What the Pussy Riot performance did, as I mentioned, it didn't instigate the promulgation of new laws. It led to calls for specific blasphemy laws and to significant increases in penalties in the existing laws forgiving religious offense. Politicians and church leaders were especially prominent in calling for these laws, although it should be pointed out that such calls were generally popular with the population as a whole, and the church did not speak with one voice. A small minority of priests actually supported the band members and their freedom of expression. Unfortunately, one such clergyman was found stabbed to death in August 2013 outside his church. Pussy Riot is admittedly not the best example of the application of neo-blasphemy laws, as they were charged with formally hooliganism motivated by religious hatred for desecrating a church rather than straight-up blasphemy, which is usually, a speech or a visual act. But they're included here because they jump-started debate on the topic in Russia and whether there should be laws against such activities in the 21st century. Two other recent cases worth mentioning, much less dramatic, but they did receive quite a bit of attention in Russia and in the region. In 2011, actually almost 2012, December 31st, 2011, a blogger and human rights activist, Maxim Akimov, wrote a blog post headlined, "Karelia is tired of popes." And a pop in Russian is a derogatory slang term for a priest. Right? He was basically venting about economic malfeasance and too much political influence of the church. He was subsequently charged with inciting religious hatred in order to undergo observation in a psychiatric hospital. You want to talk about echoes of the Soviet past. And he eventually managed in May, so 5 months later, to flee to Estonia, where I believe he still is. A similar case happened also in September 2011, where Boris Obraztsov, the editor of the Kaliningrad newspaper Trezivятый Region, was fined 110,000 rubles, about €2,500, for criticizing Orthodox clergy's economic privileges, calling priests bearded transvestites, and sounding off about the vermin that you find at the head of any religious organization. All right. So what conclusions can we draw? What can we generalize about post-communist states? I'm sorry, I have more evidence, don't have time to present it. You'll just have to trust me a little bit on this. More specifically, how do the four hypotheses previously advanced hold up when data from case studies is brought to bear? Well, in most of these states, there are multiple, often overlapping laws that were put together in a patchwork. There was no sustained effort at lawmaking in this regard, and it proceeded in fits and starts. That the context of these laws so closely mirrors the language in categories of similar and usually prior legal precedents in Western Europe suggests the diffusion of international norms and regional learning effects. The supranational nature of the EU and its institutions is particularly amenable to fostering this, as EU membership or EU accession process facilitated the provision of expert technical assistance to all of the post-communist states that were on the candidacy track. In contrast, there's little evidence to support that these laws were implemented to avoid societal strife between domestic groups. A 2004 study actually found a negative statistical correlation between pluralism and state regulation of religion, and there's no indication that this has changed at all. The same holds true for the hypothesis about reversion to pre-communist patterns. This is one area where the pre-communist past has not seemingly reared its head. What does show a positive correlation is that between strong agent advocates and legal outcomes. This is especially so if the institutional church is closely tied to ruling political coalitions, either as a partner, such as in Poland, or as a handmaiden, junior partner, such as in Russia. Grassroots agitation for such laws, except in the case of very publicized examples, does not seem to be a real motivational factor. And even then, it's usually ex post rather than ex ante in its influence relative to this publicization. Moreover, the scant number of prosecutions and the generally high-level visibility of the individuals involved in these cases that are actually prosecuted suggest minimal criminal sanctions are in place not to offer real incentives for modeling behavior, but rather to serve as an instrumental political tool and a symbolic and cathartic outlet. However, I think it's important to point out that one cause need not explain the totality of the outcome. What appears to be taking place today in Eastern Europe is a complex bargaining game being played out at the domestic, regional, and international levels. And moreover, the proximate past of this region suggests that politically, laws banning extremism of all sorts, political as well as religious, have a high degree of historical salience. People don't want people wearing communist symbols. They certainly don't want people wearing symbols associated with the Third Reich. And this has often been bundled part and parcel. In fact, one of the laws I didn't have a chance to read you, Russian law prohibits incitement of religious hatred and wearing of Nazi symbols together in the same statute, same paragraph. Okay, I'm finishing up, I promise. The two most interesting findings, though, are, one, that while much of the language and context for these laws appears to have been borrowed from the West, in the West such laws are increasingly moving away from protecting the majority from dangerous minority opinions and instead protecting minorities from the tyranny of the majority. In the post-communist world, the trend, if anything, is in the opposite directions. Here, such laws are frequently applied to protect majoritarian sensibilities from unpopular challenges. And number two, last but not least, restrictions on freedom of speech relative to religion seem to be staying static or growing rather than diminishing in this region. In this regard, they mirror a wider trend towards legislating behavior and recall. And I'm specifically thinking of the imposition of memory laws and genocide denial laws throughout Europe. And this movement has been very strong in East Central Europe particularly. These countries have pushed very fervently and passionately to have, for instance, Stalinism recognized as a crime commensurate with the crimes of Nazism. All right, there's a lot more to say, but I think I'll end there. Thank you for your time.
So, greetings, everybody, and thank you, Anne and Lexi, for inviting me and for taking care of me so well the last couple of days. And you know, having been at all sessions, I think it's been a fascinating conversation. This effort to talk between religion, or maybe religious studies, that isn't completely clear, and law, politics, economics, neuroscience, psychology. There's this sort of religion and move. And naturally, over that kind of conversation puts a lot of pressure on religion as a word and as a concept. And I think what we've seen, one of the things we've seen over the last couple of days, and there's a lot of beginning conversations, I think, that we've had, is this pressure on the word religion. As someone who has spent a couple of decades studying religion and law, one of the strategies that I've found for dealing with what the general assumption in legal studies is that something called religious law is in fact not law. I mean, that would be a kind of simple assumption by most secular legal scholars. Religious law is religion. We saw this yesterday in one of the presentations. So one of the strategies that I've found is to take religious law seriously as law, think about it as law as opposed to religion. So what I'm going to talk about today is actually what would be categorized by most legal scholars as not law, that is, that it's religion. So I want to talk about it as law. So as I said, law presents a particular problem for scholars of religion. Thomas Reed Powell, Harvard law professor in the early 20th century, famously said that if you think you can think about a thing inextricably attached to something else without thinking of the thing to which it is attached, then you have a legal mind. And there's many examples that reinforce that wonderful observation. And going to law school really is about creating in you a legal mind which is incapable of thinking about the things to which it is attached. But I do think there is a sense in which the same might be said of the religious mind, or maybe of the religious studies mind. So for religious studies, I think part of the challenge of understanding law is understanding that law is as problematic a category as religion. It is typical for scholars of religion, for all indeed outside of the law, to accept positive law's account of itself as a universal, sovereign, transparent, and acultural, as having no history, and to accept separation as both necessary and possible. To study law and religion is to resist the tidiness of received wisdom about the appropriate division of labor. That is, to resist law as expressing the will of the sovereignty of the secular state, and religion, on the other hand, as private, individual, chosen, and ethically oriented. It is to resist the notion that there is good religion and bad religion, and that law can and should distinguish between them. So I wish to persuade you that the natural state of affairs is rather an entwined legal and religious pluralism. Everyone experiences multiple normative demands from multiple normative regimes, informal as well as formal. Official law, the law of the institutions by whom they are employed and with which they are affiliated, religious and secular informal law in the form of the supermarket line, perhaps, which is a famous example in socio-legal studies, the queue, as the Brits would say, the rules of etiquette, popular constitutionalism, the court of public opinion, famously, which has real effects. Further, we as Americans are complicit in various forms of extrajudicial law, Guantanamo, drone strikes, lynchings. Law, in other words, looks like our understanding of religion. It's everywhere and it's messy. So when I teach an introductory course to the study of law and religion, I often begin with Isaac Bashevis Singer's In My Father's Court. In My Father's Court and its posthumous sequel, More Stories from My Father's Court, offer a composite description of a small-time rabbinic court, or Beit Din, in Warsaw in the 1910s and 1920s, through accounts of a series of cases. As the reader moves through the cases in the books and the docket deepens, Singer builds up a thicker and thicker portrait of Orthodox Jewish legal practice in that time and place. Disputes concerning marriage, divorce, and business deals gone sour, queries concerning kosher regulation, burial, and care of the poor, rules about wills and inheritance, all are brought before Singer's father and the men of his minyan. Each legal event is recounted through the all-seeing eyes of Singer's child self, a curious and precocious small boy tolerated as a fly-on-the-wall witness. Gender, sexuality, economics, Russian justice, food practices, magic, interreligious relations, war, all are subject to the highly specific, old but new formation that is modern Orthodox Jewish law. Singer's memoir illustrates the indeterminacy and interrelatedness of what Carl Llewellyn called law stuff and what we might call religion stuff, as well as the difficulty of locating once and for all their combined salience for human life. In this slim volume, we are given at once an intimate portrait of an ancient but modern religious legal system in microcosm, and the relativizing context which gave it life. All positions seem to be present in this Warsaw neighborhood, even within this very tiny community. And his father was a small-time rabbi, really small-time. There were big-time rabbis in Warsaw, but he was a small-time rabbi, maybe one apartment complex. So we see all positions, religion as comprehensive, secular law as comprehensive, religion as law, law as religion and law as the exclusive province of trained experts, religion and law as the customary ways of a people, the state all the while disappearing and reappearing like the Cheshire Cat. We see religious and legal subjects at once deeply formed by Torah and making choices among a cultural repertoire also deeply recognizable as modern, yet no less religious for being so. So in the first story, The Sacrifice, an older couple comes to Singer's father asking for a divorce. The couple is known to the community to still be in love after many decades of marriage. Indeed, Singer's mother finds their public displays of affections a sign of commonness. And yet the wife insists that she wants a divorce so that he can marry a younger woman. All she wants, she tells Singer's mother, is his happiness. I will lie next to him in the cemetery. In the other world, I will again be his wife. I will be his footstool in paradise. It has all been settled. Meanwhile, though, she says, he is still like a young man. He can still have children. Besides, she is an orphan. She will be good to him. The neighborhood women, including Singer's mother, are outraged. And I quote, "My mother tried to dissuade her, like the other women. My mother saw in this affair an affront to all womankind. If all old men were to start divorcing their wives and marrying young girls, the world would be in a fine state. Mother said that the whole idea was clearly the work of the evil one, and that such love was an impure thing. She even quoted one of the books on ethics. But this simple woman, too, could cite scripture. She reminded my mother of how Rachel and Leah had given their maidservants, Bilhah and Zilpah, to Jacob as concubines. The community was divided into two parts. The affair was discussed everywhere. But Singer's father and the other men are agreed. Even an old man is obligated to be fruitful and multiply. Since both parties are in agreement, the divorce must be granted. As for the younger Singer, he explains that he liked weddings and divorces. At weddings, I always got a piece of sponge cake and a sip of brandy or wine. And when my father earned some money from a divorce, I would be given a few groschen to buy sweets. And then, after all, I was a man." This is the 6-year-old Singer self speaking. As with the rest of the cases in this book, The Sacrifice excites the family and it causes community-wide conversation and upheaval that is eventually woven back into the ongoing life under the law. Law both governs all and can only do so much. Singer's father, the law speaker, one might say, in sort of Icelandic terms, sometimes seems simply to yield to the stronger wills of the litigants with their own readings of the law, with their own legal consciousness or legal subjectivity, one might say, as contemporary legal anthropologists and sociologists describe it, blessing their stubborn insistence while taking the opportunity to teach and exhort his congregations to faithful adherence. In My Father's Court is a beautiful and elegiac book. It is a story about a religious past that the author no longer fully believes in, but he wants us to join him in his yearning for this past, legal and religious. In many ways, it's an intimate, on-the-ground account of legal secularization. On one reading of secularization, I think there's another way you could say that this stepping back, of course, occurs within this religious tradition. And you see Singer's father stepping back. So you see both in the way that Suzanne described, this kind of constant sort of secularization all the way down or something, or the religion and secular intention all the way down. So the particular ultra-Orthodox practices of Singer's father are increasingly relativized and arguably transformed by the pressure of social change, by the presence and practice of other Orthodox and Hasidic rabbis, and of the official rabbis licensed by the state. So he can't be licensed by the state because he doesn't speak Russian or German, which is the main reason he can't be an official rabbi. So he's in fact practicing illegally as a judge in this community. It's also relativized by the swirling politics of Zionism, Marxism, and socialism, by the distant siren song of America and American Judaism, and by the Christian norms and ways of Poland. Singer's father ministers to a tiny group, and Singer is clear that even within Orthodox legal circles, his father is regarded as extreme in his conformity to a mystical and ascetic commitment to living in the end times. He portrays his father as both one of the last of a soon-to-be extinct and exotic example of pre-modern piety, a father he personally experienced as repressive and out of touch, while he also holds him up as a prophet of a utopian legality ideally suited to all. This contradiction plays out in the cases, with their many layered Hasidic distinctions and differences competing with the classicism of their topoi. The persistence of efforts to recognize and legitimate alternative jurisdictional enclaves under state law today suggests the continued importance of alternative legal cultures and the prescience of Singer's observations. So Singer's father and mother, having come to Warsaw from villages in Poland, are each the descendant of important rabbis. And one of the things that's fun about this book is you see internal pluralism within the religious community, even within the family, in fact. So there are competing versions of what it is to be Jewish and how Jewish law ought to be understood, even within the family. So Singer's father is, in fact, a descendant of the Baal Shem Tov, 18th century founder of Hasidic Judaism, and he has come to Warsaw after failing to find a place in the dynastic complexities of the shtetl. Speaking neither Russian or Polish, he's unable to qualify as a licensed rabbi. His jurisdiction is the small compass of his following among the inhabitants of their apartment block on Krochmalna Street, and occasionally others. His court is both subject to and rejects the overlordship of the Russian state. As war approaches, there is the overwhelming presence of the military draft. And always there's the threat of the Enlightenment, the Jewish Enlightenment, as well as broader intellectual trends. And most worrying to Singer's father, of worldliness. Only fidelity to Torah can forestall these threats. Singer's mother was also the daughter of a famed rabbi, and also learned. She occasionally offers competing interpretations of the law. She's pictured by Singer as the rationalist to her husband's often harrowing mysticism. The Singers eke out a living in a crowded Dickensian apartment block without gas or indoor plumbing, number 10 Krochmalna Street, where Singer's father reluctantly sets up his legal court, their only income being the fees he receives for his legal work and contributions from his congregation. They are so poor that Singer's mother must shop each day for the food for that day. Sabbath observance is stringent, but always relieved by the joy of company, singing, brandy, and expectation. With one foot in the next world, always lamenting the worldliness of those around him and the persistence of the diaspora, his father yearns for the day the Messiah will come. Without law, he says, there is chaos. Formally speaking, Singer's father has no formal means of enforcing his judgments. He has, as he says, no Cossacks. In the author's note to In My Father's Court, Singer offers his book not as a footnote to history, but as a model for the future, as universal justice realized. And I think this is quite a remarkable statement. So this is in this little author's note at the beginning of the book. It is my firmest conviction, Singer says, that the court of the future will be based on the Beit Din, provided the world goes morally forward instead of backward. Though the Beit Din is rapidly disappearing, I believe it will be reinstated and evolve into a universal institution. The concept behind it is that there can be no justice without godliness, and the best judgment is one accepted by all the litigants with goodwill and trust in divine power. The opposite of the Beit Din are all institutions that employ force, whether of the right or the left. What can Singer possibly mean by this? How can the legal system of this tiny backward sect do all of this? The details of the cases Singer presents are fascinating in themselves, but his judgments also illustrate the flexible capacity of law. The ability of Singer's father's law to enable a customized justice to fit the startling and varied human situations brought before him is seemingly never ending. There is at once a real dignity in the elevation of both small generosities and the inevitable pettiness of human selfishness to a place in the divine legal order. So much of Singer's father's work consists of rulings on kosher regulation, often right in the midst of food preparation. So many of the women who come to him, of course, cannot afford to lose the food that has become of questionable legality. And like Singer's mother, they are shopping each day. So this is a question that comes up each day in the midst of shopping and food preparation. or sometimes at his mother who, and then it's interesting the role she has in this court as a legal, in a way, advisor. So this is another, each chapter, at least at the beginning of the book, is a different case, if you like, in sort of legal terms. So this chapter is called Why the Geese Shrieked. A woman arrives with 2 geese she has brought to cook for supper. She announces that although properly slaughtered, they keep shrieking when she is preparing them. And Singer describes her demonstration, quote, "The woman took one goose and hurled it against the other. At once a shriek was heard. It is not easy to describe that sound. It was like the cackling of a goose, but in such a high, eerie pitch, with such groaning and quaking that my limbs grew cold." Singer's father takes the sound to be the warning sound of a demon, and he speaks, quote, "Woe, woe, and still they blaspheme. It is written that the wicked do not repent even at the very gates of hell." Singer's mother, on the other hand, considers the matter carefully, observes that slaughtered geese don't shriek, and then deliberately takes up the geese and removes their windpipes, showing then that they no longer shriek. And it's actually quite longer in the story, that sort of playing out of his father's concerns about demonic possession, but also his kind of prophesying over this, the presence of the demon. Singer's father is not impressed. Quote, "Mother went back to the kitchen. I remained with my father." Again, the men together, you see. "Suddenly he began to speak to me as though I were an adult. 'Your mother takes after your grandfather, the rabbi of Bilgarai. He is a great scholar, but a cold-blooded rationalist. People warned me before our betrothal. And then father threw up his hands as if to say, it's too late now to call off the wedding. This small household seems to hold together a plethora of Jewish options, even while it stands together against the impurity outside." And I'm quoting Singer, "In our home, the world itself was treff, ritually unclean." Perhaps the most moving of the cases, a gruesome question, begins one Sabbath night as his father sits with his congregation over the Sabbath meal. Quote, "On this particular Sabbath evening, fresh snow had fallen, and the ground outside seemed to take on a special look of brightness. Frost palms blossomed on the window panes, reminding me of the land of Israel. In the midst of this spirit of hopeful anticipation, with its promise of blessings and fulfillment, the door opened and a poor Jew entered. He was not like an ordinary pauper, but like an old storybook beggar." So then the old man addresses the Rabbi Singer's father. "Rabbi, may a man sleep with his dead wife?" The men of the congregation turn pale. Then the old man explains. His wife has died and cannot be buried until the following day. They have only one bed and live in a cellar. In order to protect her body from rats, he wonders whether he may legally sleep in the bed with her corpse. Instantly, the Sabbath assembly rises. What had been framed as a question of law becomes, in a sense, an occasion for social action. They reconstitute themselves as the welfare committee. This is my reading. A collection is taken up. A makeshift cot is found. Men and women go to the man's home to help him. Singer and his father are from the priestly caste and cannot enter where there is a dead body, but the others go in to help the old man, and Singer, this is his 6-year-old self, right, peers into the window, frightened by what he observes. People speak of the unprecedented nature of such poverty and the portent it holds. The limits and the possibilities of the law are revealed, and Singer's father cries out, "Dear Father in heaven, woe, it is high time for our salvation, high time." And Singer dryly notes that, quote, "Our Sabbath night was ruined, and the week that followed was a meager one, because my father had given part of my mother's weekly allowance to the poor man. Poor as they are, there are others yet poorer." Because of Singer's profound honesty and extraordinary art, and of course he is a Nobel Prize winner for literature, I love reading this book, I've read it many times, We see both the attractions and the dark side of this intimate world where law is both awesome and tailored to the individual. Singer admires the comprehensiveness of Jewish law, its relevance for every moment of every day, and its capacity for humanity. And yet he resists its claustrophobic insularity and intolerance. One of the most extraordinary moments in the book, now I'm going to just read, is not very much explained, but I think is revealing and not accidentally present in the book. So, quote, "Every morning before prayer time, Father sat by a window that looked out on the square, smoking his pipe and drinking innumerable glasses of tea as he studied and wrote. Before Father's eyes, thieves picked pockets, snatched bundles, and conducted their crooked lotteries. But Father was absolutely unaware of their existence. The neighborhood teemed with Zionists, socialists, territorialists, assimilationists. Yiddish and Hebrew secular literature already existed, but to Father, all of this non-Jewishness signified nothing. One Sabbath evening, we heard the screams of a woman. Father walked out onto the balcony and inquired of our neighbor, Reb Chaim, what had happened. 'It's nothing for you to worry about, Rabbi. Some girl has been raped.' Embarrassed, Father went inside and ordered the windows to be shut. Only a thin wall separated his study from the forces of evil." End of quotation. It is a chilling moment. We do not know whether his father is unable or unwilling to help her, but the woman's suffering seems beyond the reach of his father's court. In a series of interviews he gave in the 1960s, Singer talked about his early life on Krokmalna Street and his view of Jewish law. So both his brother, who had become a writer in Warsaw, and he represents sort of another Jewish option in the book. He's sort of formally an apostate in some sense, but clearly still very much part of the family, goes to New York, becomes a writer and publisher, and then Singer follows him. So the question's asked, "Your skepticism about Judaism began when you were very young, didn't it?" Answer, "I always loved Judaism and I always believed in God, but as far as dogma is concerned, doubt began very early, because I saw that these dogmas are man-made things. I did not believe that God told Moses, let's say, not to touch money on the Sabbath or not to write on the Sabbath. They have millions and millions of little laws. They made from one law 50, and then from the 50, 1,000, and so on. Every generation added something new." So we get here a hint of the process of multiplication in the many small cases that come before his father, the power of casuistry, the seduction of adding something new. It is, in a sense, particularity all the way down. These cases and the many more that are related in the two books show us a legal world in which law is close to the people and in which religious cosmologies and anthropologies explicitly authorize and inform law's dominion. Cultural coherence enables the production of law stuff and religion stuff, but always in negotiation with other legal worlds. So do we call this religion or is this law? If it's both, how should we understand their relationship? The jurisdiction of Singer's father is for sure without official force in the kind of modern state sense. He has no Cossacks, and yet people mostly do what he says. He does not enforce the law out of the state, and yet the state is constantly present and relevant. Lawrence Rosen, in his ethnographic study of the Qadi court in Morocco, argued that rather than understanding religious law to be a special category of law, legal forms should be grouped according to legal characteristics. Their religiousness is, in a sense, not really the important point. And in his work on the Qadi court, which had often been characterized as irrationally subjective and arbitrary, he argued rather it should be understood as a form of customary law built on cases and founded in cultural logics, new and old, very much like the British common law, in fact, rather than understood to be defective and wanting from a perspective of legal modernists seeking universal codes and legal determinacy. The Beit Din of early 20th century Warsaw is likewise both continuous with an ancient form of legal reasoning enshrined in commentaries and a place of mediation very specific to that time and place, taking its color from the history and cultural ways of Ashkenazic Judaism. Its subjects live always simultaneously in multiple worlds, multiple Jewish worlds, and the shifting jurisdictions of Poland under various occupations. In this vast and varied legal landscape, religion takes its place as both regulator and regulated. Countries with Muslim immigrant populations entertain proposals today to create Sharia courts, to hear personal law causes. Muslim-majority countries seek to be both Islamic and democratic, affording non-Muslim population, such as the Copts in Egypt, various degrees of self-rule. Indigenous populations across the globe have successfully forced the ceding of bits of sovereignty through a combination of treaty rights and demands for self-government. The U.S. Supreme Court has held that churches in the U.S. have the right, and I notice you didn't talk about the U.S. in your case, which we might talk about, George, later. The U.S. Supreme Court has held that churches in the U.S. have the right to handle certain employee relations issues through their internal legal systems, exempt from national civil rights legislation. Both Amish and Hasidic communities in the U.S. and elsewhere have managed to create their own legal spaces, formally and informally. And it wasn't today as well as in early 20th century Warsaw. India, Israel, and many other countries with mixed populations contain special jurisdictions for certain areas of law. The Vatican operates both as a nation-state in the modern sense and administers a supranational legal system that operates by treaty or by consent through much of the world. The internet is also making possible the regularizing and democratizing of religious law in interesting ways. These variations in legal living reflect an erosion of the exclusivity of state law and its claim to a secular sovereignty understood to be a zero-sum game. At the same time, there is a reimagining of religion as inevitably legal and political, and law as inevitably religious. As Bruno Latour says, what we are left with after we give up on separation and purification, after we give up on the church and the state as the only proxies for both known and unknown constituencies, is the place of what Latour calls the meticulous triage of circumstances. A triage with more or less potential for disaster, as the Commonwealth have shown on their work in law in sub-Saharan Africa. For many today, even to consider the possibility of religiously infused law is to contemplate the threat of an inevitable slide into what is often called theocracy, a condition imagined as the dogmatic and totalitarian rule by intolerant and inflexible self-appointed priests sanctioned by divine right. And yet all law operates within cosmologies and anthropologies that are shot through with religious ideas, practices, and genealogies, as countless recent works have shown. While the Shoah is foreshadowed in every letter in my father's work, I do not think that that brutal fact prevents our also taking Singer's account as an ethnographic portrait of a religious law or of a legal religion, or perhaps just an instantiation of the universal religio-legal nature of human life. Singer himself seems to have been of two minds about the form of Jewish legalism he represented in this book. He himself chose, even before he left Poland with his brother, to leave Orthodox Jewish practice. And at various points in the book, he mentions the proliferation of rabbis. He thought there were too many rabbis, there was too much competition and too little work. But it also seems to have portended for him a community whose law was exhausted in some sense. And this tension is throughout the book, both the sort of exhaustion of Jewish law and yet his hope that it somehow represented a kind of ideal law. Jews have for millennia governed themselves using Jewish law within the shadow of other legal regimes. Jewish law in the time of the Romans adapted itself to enable a Jewish life in a bustling, diverse world. A myriad of such adjustments occurred in Jewish diaspora communities around the globe. One new dispensation came with Napoleon's setting up of a council of Jewish notables, and Orthodox Jewish law today is in conversation with other ethical traditions. The Dalai Lama, in fact, has consulted with rabbis about how to live as a diasporic community. And Jewish lawyers, of course, have been important in the creation of what's called secular law. The effort responsibly to extend current academic accounts of the relationship of law and religion to encompass all known human ways of life is causing pressure on both. This is partly the case because of the feverish politics of religious freedom advocacy. neo-Kantian accounts of law are being criticized for their fundamentally Christian individualist understandings of the human person and the exclusionary effects that result. These risks are acute in discussing Jewish law because of the way in which Jewish law figures in opposition to Christian love in various appropriations of Paul and in anti-Semitic literature generally. Singer is a complex figure, too religious for the secular and too secular for the religious. A man with the work ethic and imagination of his father and the rationalism and practicality of his mother. His conclusion, only that which is individual and can be just and true, could be said of both law and religion. Thank you.
Adrian, would you like to go first? Sure. You can actually sit over there.
Oh, can I sit over there?
Yeah, that's fine, we'll swing the camera over.
I'm really happy about that. Okay. Great. So, thank you, Professor Smith, Sullivan, and Soroka, for these engaging papers that have made us think more profoundly about the interaction between religious and secular law. As Professor Sullivan points out, law presents a particular problem for scholars of religion. Law, at least in its secular form, is often seen as regulating religion, or as something that exists outside of religion, that controls how it is expressed and the spaces in which it can appear. So Professor Soroka gives us a pertinent example of this in his work on blasphemy laws. So as Professor Sullivan points out, religion and law have often been imagined as, quote, occupying a radically different space and time. But your papers today reverse this paradigm by demonstrating how religious and secular law exist in relation to one another. Rather than being distinctly separate, each paper has shown us that we only know the limits and the contours of the religious because it is contrasted with the secular. So I'm going to begin with Professor Sullivan. Professor Sullivan, in your elegantly written piece, you take us into the world of a rabbinical court to demonstrate the intertwined state of religion and the law. In Singer's father's court, we encounter the grand sweep of what rabbinic law regulates, from the mysteries of human love to the nitty-gritty decisions over the shrieking of geese. Law in his father's court is, quote, both awesome and tailored to the individual. You praise the flexibility of these applications of the law, and you remark that they demonstrate how a negotiation can take place between laws, ideas, and human practices. Yet, it seems that we might question whether Singer romanticizes the law of his father's court. How many of us would be comfortable without a court of appeals? And how would we feel about a court where the judge and the jury were one and the same? So some might dismiss my concerns as obsolete, but as we know, religious law is not confined to some romantic past. It continues to hold sway in many communities today. I was reminded of this by a student this week who was telling me about a controversy in her hometown in Texas. When the basketball team at her Jewish day school made it to the playoffs, they couldn't compete because the game was being held during Shabbat. So these conflicts, what Professor Sullivan calls the interaction between religious law and unofficial law, occur frequently in our contemporary world. Yet abiding by a religious law in a 21st century society poses some problems that weren't present in Singer's Warsaw. What happens when we leave the religious community and the rabbi is no longer there to interpret the law? Does it become the individual believer's responsibility or even their right to interpret the law for themselves? Who do religious people consult when they interpret the law? What are the possibilities and problems posed when they turn to preachers on YouTube, to online fiqh councils, and to blogs? How does the engagement between law and religion work in a globalized world? And how does modernity complicate this relationship between law and religion? And what possibilities does it open up for us? Okay, so Professor Smith, you take up the question of the relationship between religious law and secular law in a fascinating study of the visual secular in works of art. Your compelling paper asks us to, quote, locate what it is that we look for when we look for the secular. You argue that a moment of critical disengagement is a marker of the visual secular. So if critical distance is a moment that marks the visual secular, you also note that this moment is possibly consistent with religious transcendence. Here you seem to refer to a key theme in the study of religion, one illustrated by Talal Asad, which is that in recognizing the secular, we are also recognizing the sacred. So in other words, the secular and the sacred emerge together, and they depend on one another. You portray this dependent relationship beautifully with the help of Chagall's feast day. You draw our attention to the miniature rabbi, whom we are invited to imagine is a representation of the secular. We know this, you say, because he is stepping away, and thus performing the moment of critical distance. Yet, you remark, we only see him as a secular figure, because he is juxtaposed to the larger rabbi. Only when the miniature rabbi steps away from that which his larger, law-abiding counterpart is moving towards do we recognize him as a representation of the visual secular. So if stepping back is the secular, then not stepping back is assumed to be the religious. But this supposed lack of critical distance in the religious, I think, is not necessarily a bad thing. If we take Assad's description of religion as a discursive tradition into account, not stepping back, or perhaps even being tied to a tradition, might be an accurate description of the religious. According to Assad, a discursive tradition shapes particular dispositions and ways of being. So not stepping back doesn't necessarily mean we're not gaining critical distance. It could just mean that we're shaped by our traditions. Furthermore, if religion can be seen as a discursive tradition, can we imagine the secular as a discursive tradition as well? Could the secular also be a tradition that forms particular dispositions? In this sense, although you describe the secular as a moment of gaining critical distance, if we see the secular as a discursive tradition, then we could see how the secular also ties us to certain patterns of thought and secular traditions. By imagining the secular as a discursive tradition, you might be able to upend that idea that critical self-questioning and criticism is a special province of modern secularism. And finally, Professor Soroka, you provide us with a careful and incisive look at blasphemy and hate speech laws in Eastern Europe. You ask, quote, why have politicians in certain post-communist states in Eastern Europe adopted laws criminalizing blasphemy and anti-religious speech? How have these legal restrictions manifested themselves? I wonder, though, about the relationship between blasphemy and hate speech. How are they understood in relation to each other? If blasphemy, as you say, is imagined as protecting religion itself, hate speech is seen as protecting the people who might be harmed from an incitement to hate. So my question to you is, what does it mean to protect a concept like religion as opposed to protecting people? I also wonder about the limits of blasphemy laws. How have they been tested by religious diversity? I'm thinking in particular about the publication of the Satanic Verses in the UK in 1989. So Muslims tried to appeal to blasphemy laws in this case, but they really couldn't because these laws traditionally only protected Christianity and not Islam. I think it's my understanding that the blasphemy laws in the UK have since been repealed.
They've been repealed, but you're right. The blasphemy law only talked about the Anglican Church.
Right.
Actually.
So how do you think that blasphemy laws, particularly in Eastern Europe, will change in view of the different religious traditions that might want to take advantage of these laws? And then finally, in thinking about how you define the religious and the secular, I wonder how you could think about this differently. You point to surveys about attendance and belief in God. So lower numbers of people who say they believe in God seems to equal a secular society. People who don't go to church, people who don't believe in God, secular society. So why, do you ask, do these secular societies institute blasphemy laws? But I wonder if we could imagine, though, a set of religious sensibilities that are tied to a sensitivity about religion, even if people say they don't believe in God. In some ways, this might be a reversal of Grace Davies' idea of believing without belonging. So in post-communist regimes, we might seem to have a sense of belonging without believing. So thanks, all of you, for these carefully crafted papers. I think I speak for a lot of us when I say that they opened up new questions about the nature of the relationship between law, the religious and the secular, and they helped me think through these concepts in new ways. Thank you.
We'll have the other response before we have you respond. So,
Okay, right. Thank you, everyone. I'd like to begin by thanking the panelists first, as I've just done, and thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you to Professor Monius, Lexi, all the CSWR staff for putting this on and for inviting me to participate as well. I'm very grateful for the opportunity, and thank you. I've learned much from each of our three presenters, and I think that there's so much on offer here. I'm frightened that I will not be able to do justice to the depth and breadth of what we have heard. So I apologize for that, but I'd like to focus in on a couple of key threads. One thing that really stuck out to me as I was preparing for this presentation is the fact that we had a curious coincidence of focus on, artistic representations of the overlapping worlds of law, religion, and the secular, composed by Jewish artists who are all in the process of negotiating what we might think of as a modern secular Jewish identity in Professor Sullivan and Professor Smith's presentations. And these works of art are all characterized by what we might think of as a sense of loss, in part for obvious historical reasons, but I also want to think about what that might have to do with the secular. The title of this panel is, I think, Religious Law, Secular Law. And so it's kind of a curious coincidence that 2/3 of what we've heard from has been about Jewish art. So that's what I'm going to be thinking through. And I think I'll start, I'm going to skip ahead because this was too long when I timed it, but with this notion of the visual secular that Dr. Smith presented us with, and I was very interested in that kind of idea. So you talked about Clement Greenberg's description of modernism. What is modern in modernist art is what is self-consciously self-critical. Of course, there can be self-conscious self-criticism from within the bounds of religious art too, as you acknowledge. But I was wondering then, which is what you talked about, what might we call the secular in modern art? So you've defined visual secular in terms of a presentation of distance from a given experience or set of norms that does not necessarily entail a clean departure from them. So this self-reflective approach to scenes and figures from Jewish life appears in the works of Chagall not as a definitive rejection of Jewish law then, but as a kind of critical distance actually manifested in the way that the images from Jewish cultural or religious life are presented on the canvas. We could think of it as the curious juxtaposition of the big rabbi with the smaller rabbi that Deirdre just mentioned. So they are figures from Jewish life, but it's the way in which they're handled, not the kinds of images that are used so much, but the way that the images are handled. Is that the correct characterization?
Yeah.
Good. Okay. That creates the visual secular. So good. Good. Okay. So what I was thinking then was, so this is a secular perspective, and is there a way in which we see a secular perspective also in Singer's work? And I think that there definitely is, and that's what I'd like to reflect on, is this kind of common thread for a moment. So Singer decided for himself to abandon the jurisdiction of his father's court when he left orthodoxy, and this decision shapes the frame of reference for his reminiscences. He looks back upon his father's court with an unflinching gaze, albeit not without a kind of yearning. So then, is his memoir to be understood as the reminiscences of a now secularized, non-believing adult Singer reflecting back on the lost world of religious and cultural coherence in which he lived as a child? I offer this suggestion as one way to think about what it might mean if we were to consider In My Father's Court as somehow characterized by a secular perspective, similar to the visual secular that Professor Smith identified in the arts of Chagall. This reading I've just offered seems both obvious and also problematic because essentially it seems to reproduce assumptions found in triumphalist narratives of secularization as a process of maturation out of religion. But on the other hand, it really does look like a central component of the kind of story that Singer is telling. Is it that they're both kind of alienated from the worlds of cultural coherence of the Jewish community, and their artworks engage with this kind of alienation that produces what we might think of as a secular perspective in their works? I don't have a definitive answer to that, but that's a question. The figure of the man on his way out, who's the wandering Jew who appears throughout lots of Chagall's works with Jewish themes, seems to be perpetually exiting but never quite gone. And in Singer's reminiscences, there is always this yearning for a past way of life that cannot be recaptured in some ways. Not that he's uncritical of that past way of life, but there's some desire there, I think. In The Walking Village, one of the pieces of Chagall's works shown, there's a phrase in Yiddish that says, what do I need it? The transparent lucidity. And what is this transparent lucidity? I think it's important for thinking through how the secular might appear in this kind of art. So, perhaps this evocative phrase marks a gesture towards what Professor Sullivan has termed cultural coherence, a characteristic of, and this is a quote from Professor Sullivan's paper, a world in which law is close to people and in which religious cosmologies and anthropologies explicitly authorize and inform law's dominion. And I would add, for the purposes of this discussion, and not just law's dominion in a kind of abstract sense, but also just the structuring of daily life. So what do I need a transparent lucidity? There's certainly a critical distance from the world of committed religious belief or practice, religious cosmologies and anthropologies in this phrase, but it's also, as Deirdre pointed out, going to always be a reference to a religious world, even if it seems to look like a rejection. So I imagined it's easy to think of Singer secularizing as a young man, saying something like, what do I need at this transparent lucidity, as he's, from his father's perspective, corrupted and secularizing. And yet, just as the man on his way out never leaves the picture, the old man Singer, appearing as author in the preface cited by Professor Sullivan, voices a utopian hope for a future moral order that would resemble that of his father's court, imperfect though that court may have been. So I'm trying to figure out how we could see the secular in literature as well as in this visual art, and see if we can have a conversation between these two works in the way that we would interpret them. Dr. Smith talked about Freud's 1914 essay, The Moses of Michelangelo. And this is, to me, is very, very interesting with your idea of the visual secular. It's in the Chagall's artworks, like Feast Day, for example, the visual secular appears in the way that religious images are played with and presented. What might otherwise be religious imagery appears from a secular perspective due to jarring juxtapositions, for example. Though in Freud's essay, he looks at a statue of Moses and interprets it in a completely secular light. But this is actually a very interesting essay from Freud, because although he's trying to engage in what Freud himself characterizes as self-critical reflection from a disengaged perspective, we might think, on the one hand, this disengagement opens space for a secular perspective about the artwork, so he has a secular reading of Moses. However, it's important to note that Freud's scientific, psychoanalytic, supposedly disengaged interpretation of the Moses of Michelangelo has a complicated relationship to Freud's own attempt to define secular Jewish identity. And in fact, I think that that piece is quite similar to Singer's writings in that it's actually an essay about Freud's own Jewish identity in the process of secularization. So there's a common thread there. His essay was actually, you mentioned a threefold disengagement in that essay published by Freud. There's the one he identifies in the figure of Moses, the one he attributes to Michelangelo, and the one he attributes to himself. And there's actually a fourth, because he published that essay in the journal Imago in 1914 anonymously. And in Peter Gay's biography of Freud, he notes that Freud compared himself, he referred to the essay as his love child, and he also referred to himself repeatedly in his personal letters as Moses, particularly in his relationship to Carl Jung. And right before he published that essay about Freud's Moses was when he had the split with Jung. Some years before, in 1909, in a letter to Sandor Ferenczi, he had written, I fear that my Joshua, Jung, may reach the promised land of psychiatry, but Freud will not get there, obviously putting himself in the position of Moses. And let's see, what else? He wrote also to Sandor Ferenczi, right when he was visiting that statue in Rome, writing to Sandor, he wrote, I compare myself with the historical rather than with the Moses of Michelangelo that I've interpreted, implying that he himself, like the historical Moses of his understanding, was subject to fits of temper. So this kind of self-critical disengagement that Freud is engaged in, the threefold disengagement, with the fourth mode of anonymous writing, another kind of disengagement, is characterized by Peter Gay in the biography of Freud as a case of protesting too much against an unself-critical emotional identification with the figure of Moses. Of course, Peter Gay is psychoanalyzing Freud's essay. It's a biography of Freud, so it seems appropriate to use that kind of method. Freud saw himself as comparable to Moses in that he envisions his own role to be that of the lawgiver. So you mentioned that the tablets in the statue are blank, and Freud doesn't really talk very much about the law at all. But in actual, I was thinking through it, and I think Freud is actually using the law, as he understands it, of psychoanalysis to generate the reading of a secularized Moses, which is actually the secular Jewish identity that stands in for Freud himself in a way. So he sees himself, Freud obviously describes himself as this heroic champion of science, secularizer of culture, mind and body, but that image is fundamentally anchored in this biblical figure of Moses. And the really interesting part is that in this basically autobiographical essay that Freud is writing on the secularization of Jewish identity, what he's using to craft his understanding of secular Jewish identity is a Christian representation of Moses in the tomb of a pope. So Freud has to go through Christianity to get to the secular Moses, which is an essay about secular Jewish identity. So that's interesting.
Yes.
So
we have to, where was the time?
Oh, I'm sorry. So secularism, Yella concludes, is functionally a religion, and Paul's rejection of Jewish ritual played a role in establishing a foundation not only for secularism, but also for anti-Semitism. So I'll just close by noting this anti-Semitism theme. That work of art that you showed us today, the White Crucifixion, it's one of my favorite pieces of Chagall's work. It's really haunting. It has a Jewish Jesus in the center, surrounded by a scene that looks like a pogrom, and there is actually an earlier version of that work of art that was there was a reproduction made of that work of art before it was first shown in New York in 1939, and the reproduction shows what was in it before he retouched it up. The soldier who's breaking into the synagogue at right is represented in a kind of ambiguous way in the image we looked at today, which is the famous one. Though originally that soldier had a swastika armband, and there was a person, a Jewish person down to the left, in traditional clothes wearing a sign that's unclear in the famous one, but the sign actually said Ich bin Judah in the reproduction which was produced before the first showing of that. And Chagall wrote in a letter to a friend that he changed it because he thought it was too obvious. So I was thinking about how that relates to Singer's story, and what I see in it is the collapse, basically, of the world of Singer's father's court. So we have these two Jewish artists that we've looked at in great detail, where the secular perspective is appearing in both of the works as a depiction of fragmentation of a world of cultural coherence. And the Jesus in the White Crucifixion is connected to the historical factors leading to that cultural fragmentation, but also depicted as suffering in solidarity as a Jew together with the other Jews. So there's this reflection on Jewish identity and also universalism in that particular piece, which is maybe why the artwork, the work of both Singer and Chagall is so appealing to so many. So I thank you all for your fantastic presentations, and the question I have, the easiest first question is, what do you make of the fact that the works of Chagall and Singer have appeared together in this panel on religion, religious law, and secular law? Do you see something in common style, substance, content between the two that we might characterize as secular for some reason, as I've been trying to do? Does any common feature have import specifically for understanding secularization, or how secularization is depicted and represented? I think it's all about representations of subjectivity in the case of Singer and Freud particularly, and I don't speak very competently in the realm of how visual art is understood and interpreted, but I would say it's the same kind of process. Question one. Question two, Professor Sullivan, you mentioned in your paper that you begin a class on religion and law with this work. So I'd like to ask, what do you hope the students take away from reading this work in a class on religion and law? And how do the students respond to this work? A lot of people here, I think, are teaching, and it's something that many of us, I'm sure, are interested to hear. And Dr. Smith, does the term visual secular specifically refer to a certain handling of what would otherwise be religious images? I characterized it okay?
Yeah.
If so, can you share with us any other artists beyond Chagall in whose work you see this perspective that might be comparable to Chagall? Those two questions. Thank you. Sorry for going over.
So before we open it up to the audience, would you like to each in turn respond?
Sure. Go ahead. Well, first I want to apologize for going on a little bit long. I actually wrote 15 double-spaced pages, and I thought I had it all under control and I could just roll it. But strange things happen in delivery, and I think I was overcome by my insufficiently self-critical enthusiasm for this topic. And, you know, it's interesting, would we say that my presentation was insufficiently secular because it spilled over and was suggestive of immersion beyond what was appropriate? No, we would not. In order for something, and this is precisely the problem of why the visual secular in particular, as distinguished from the secular, is, as you've both beautifully and really brilliantly brought up in your wonderful responses, so hard to get at relative to the secular. So we can't, my initial approach to this whole issue began with where I think a lot of people's thinking about the secular begins, which is with Charles Taylor's A Secular Age, and his notion that the religious self is a porous self who's open to, you know, voices and various paraphernalia coming in from outside. And his suggestion is that the secular self is a buffered self who somehow has means of resistance to keep out. And just sort of out of curiosity, and because when I get stuck thinking of things conceptually and verbally, I tend to think what they would look like visually. I thought, you know, what would a buffered self look like? What would a porous self look like? And then I also happened to visit the Rothko Chapel, which, if you've ever been there, mysteriously, and I feels religious. Why? I do not know. So I guess in answer to sort of both of your questions about, well, could we say, for instance, that Magritte is secular? I don't know how I could see that, because the visual secular seems to be profoundly relativistic in terms of it's something relative to a conception of religion. If I look at a painting that is, or a sculpture that, well, for instance, Rothko, if you all know Rothko's work, it's just black panels in the case of the Rothko Chapel. These images, and Rothko is one where I would definitely say could be spoken of with reference to the visual secular. Where do we see that in a black panel? Or where do we not see that in a black panel? And just because the emotions of tragedy, ecstasy, and doom went into its composition, is that somehow acceptable as quote-unquote religious experience? I guess I would say that the challenge for me in thinking about all of the talks that we heard today, and I actually liked your lowbrow images a lot. And I think that, you know, one of the things that I couldn't include in my already too long talk was the lowbrow images that I myself love a lot. Like, you know, also Anselm Kiefer would be another vital part of this conversation. And I have not read The Singer. This is so tragic. But now I'm going to immediately run out and read The Singer, because it's so vital to the very questions I'm interested in. So I guess I can sincerely say, and this sounds like one of those self-protective statements, the visual secular is something that I don't know, like the Supreme Court judge who said that he, you know, couldn't say what pornography was, but he knew it when he saw it. I think looking for it is very different than thinking about the secular as one does, as discursive tradition, et cetera, et cetera. And I find the challenge of thinking of it in visual terms forces upon us the relational nature of the secular vis-a-vis religion.
George, would you like to respond to some of the points Deirdre?
Yeah, Deirdre made great points, and thank you very much. I think you made 3 points. I'll try to hit them quickly but systematically. So you ask, what does it mean to protect the concept of religion versus religious believers? I think, in my mind, I would change this to what does it mean to protect the institutional concept of religion versus the interpretation given to it by believers? Offense in all but the most egregious instances is psychological, right? It's usually not violence. When it is violence, it, as I mentioned, lapses into a different category, ontologically, legally, what have you. But so I don't see these two necessarily being in diametric tension. I think both privilege belief and faith. The question here, the central question here is, should either of these be privileged in this fashion? It's the same coin, but different sides. You still can't say things. There's still restrictions on speech. So what is qualitatively different about religion? Religion as a whole complex, not religion perceived from the side of the believer, religion from the side of the collective institutional entity. There are people who make very strong arguments about this. Joshua Mitchell, Michael Sandel talking about the encumbered self, sort of this Rawlsian translation that he does, elaboration. So I think both of these get at that central question, and that is the question that I suspect, I need to do more work on this, but I suspect all of these societies are really ultimately struggling with. It's no longer possible in Western Europe to sustain blasphemy laws, but it is possible to sustain hate speech for religion, but not many other categories. So the question becomes, why? Why are certain categories privileged? Hate speech about race, hate speech about ethnicity, hate speech about religion. What makes these qualitatively somehow different than the hate speech I'm subjected to, when I have to listen to certain political commentators every day? Or, my office mate. I say that in a purely rhetorical capacity. I have my own office. I do talk to myself occasionally. Okay, so the second question was, what might change in Eastern Europe? I'm really always loath to prognosticate, especially if I'm being filmed, but I'll give it a quick shot. I don't think much is going to change. I think this regime of legislation will increase not only across laws related to how religion can be talked about and depicted, but more generally. And this is something I'm very interested in this legislating of how we remember, what is the proper way of remembering, and not only the legislating of this, but the universalization of this narrative. I'll give you a very quick example. Viktor Yushchenko, the I was going to say penultimate, but I guess they have another president now, president of Ukraine, right? During the worst economic crisis in anybody's practically lifetime, in 2008, 2009, when I was living in Kiev, was sending envoys to Argentina to get the Argentines to recognize the Ukrainian idea that the Great Famine of 1932, 1933 was a genocide. This was so centrally important, We'll just leave that aside, but this is a trend that is increasing at a very rapid pace over there. Migration is primarily out from the region with the EU accession, with Schengen. Poles are going to France, Poles are going to London, they're moving all around. It's not so much migration in. There is some Vietnamese migration to places like Poland. There is certainly Central Asian migration to Russia. But I don't think this will be a material change, but I think Eastern Europe might change the EU a little bit more than the EU thinks it will change Eastern Europe, if that makes sense. And the final point is this sensitivity to religion. Absolutely, I think that's a brilliant point. I have to think of if there's a good way to possibly measure it, but it makes intuitive sense. Belonging virtually without believing. I mean, I resonate with this. I understand this. It makes sense. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, I know we're pressing the end of time, but let me just say thank you, both of you, for your careful reading and your thoughtful responses. So Deirdre, yes, this problem of romanticization, I think actually Singer portrays a really complicated picture, and that's one of the reasons I put the rape in there, but also Singer is really troubled by the kind of proliferation, the sort of almost sort of over fetishization of the law in this community. No court of appeal, no jury. So those are very American kinds of gestures because of the way Jewish law works. Really, rabbis are in a sense equal. I mean, not totally in the Hasidic context, but there were always other rabbis to go to. And so there is, in a sense, a kind of horizontal appeal, even if there isn't a structure of appeal in the way we think of. And of course, the jury is particular to the Anglo-American legal tradition and is not thought of as essential in most other legal traditions. As for your student and her predicament of her basketball team in Texas, you know, I think your question is an important one. Is it now the individual's responsibility somehow or right, and those are two interestingly paired in to interpret the law for herself, sort of negotiate the proliferation of law, you know, what Cover calls, you know, so this is sort of constant proliferation of law herself, and to forum shop or to do whatever she needs to do in order to find the law that will fit her situation. And I would recommend John Bowen's book, Islam and Democracy, which talks about, one of the best legal ethnographies that's ever been written about women in, and I think it's important to talk about the gendered aspect of this, which we haven't talked about enough today, but women in Indonesia who have, in a sense, three legal options. They have indigenous laws which give women certain kinds of property rights. They have Islamic law, and then they have sort of modern international and state law. And that he shows the way these are deployed differently as resources for reaching for the universal, so that sometimes you need the local, and that works for you. And these women use the local indigenous legal system when that works for them as far as their property rights are concerned. But then they also skillfully use various universal Islamist equality gestures and then international law and state law, and how these three sort of produce a kind of justice that's very, very interesting to contemplate. I don't think you can resolve the problem of which of these laws does more. I think, anyway. Adam, yes, I'm sort of trying to figure out whether Singer's father is the big rabbi or the little rabbi in the picture, and I'm not sure. I think you can make arguments for both. I think you can also ask this question about whether Singer is stepping back. Is he Chagall or not? I mean, there's some easy analogies there. I think it's important to see the mother as the figure who steps back in this story. And this connects to some comments you make. I think is really important in the use of the secular as critique, which allows a telling of this long, I mean, there's a real sort of queasiness for me in locating the secular, maybe in the axial age. I mean, we're beginning to talk about a lot of history here. I mean, really? Really, we're going to really say that the secular modern started in the axial age? And what work does that do for you? Well, speaking as a lawyer, as a legal scholar, I think what troubles me is when the secular is codified and used to police boundaries. So yes, it's a lot of fun as scholars to talk about this moment of critique, whether it happened in the axial age, and it's incredibly productive in terms of understanding Freud's relationship to this statue, which is really mind-blowing. But when it becomes codified, when it polices what people can do, I think it becomes very troubling. I'd just like to say one thing about blasphemy. So the British blasphemy law was codified in the 17th century. This is a moment of church-state consolidation. I mean, there is a sense in which blasphemy laws, I think, have to be understood basically as sedition laws. They are, in their first historical incarnation, they are laws protecting the church and state as and this is very clear in the decision, in the Rushdie decision. The judge says, my hands are tied. It's not that I don't want to protect Muslims from offenses to their religious beliefs, The problem here is that this is not a law protecting people from the offenses. It's a law protecting the state. That's what this law is for, and he's very clear about that. And I think that's an important distinction, and sometimes a problem with collapsing hate laws and blasphemy laws.
Great, well, thank you. If our panelists are willing to hang in for another 5 minutes, we could perhaps field at least a couple of questions from the audience. Questions?
We flattened you all.
Yes. Jim?
I had a question about the whole critical distance thing and the relationship to secularism, which I think is very interesting. So, I mean, it makes a lot of sense to me if you think about the masters of suspicion, Freud and Nietzsche and Marx, they're all good at doing that. But I'm wondering if it seems like it's maybe a little bit more complicated than that. I'm thinking about this example, if you think about Carl Jasper's idea of limit experiences.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, all right. So a person has an experience then which basically in their face they realize now that their way of looking at the world is not adequate to explain what has happened to them. And so in essence what they have to do is they have to back up and look at their worldview and how they're looking at things, and this has to be reevaluated. So that's a kind of critical distancing. Well, a limit experience could easily be produced by a religious experience.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, and a person could become more religious as part of an experience like that instead of less. So, I agree with you that there's some kind of a link there, but it seems like it must be there's something else going on.
Well, it's an extremely tenuous link, and thank you so much for bringing that up. I actually have a, unfortunately, 100-page long chapter on Jaspers in my book about this very problem. When Jaspers talks about the axial age, which is obviously an enormously problematic and in some ways mythic projection of his desire to construct a post-World War II world that is in accordance with his fantasies about people talking to each other incessantly. Having said that, Jaspers is importantly influenced by Omri Bergson and his notion of a sort of proto-axial period in which you know, Buddha and some other people, Socrates, and he calls it, instead of calling it a sort of moment of reflection, which Jaspers specifically uses the word reflection in German, Bergson calls it a sudden leap. And you see the language of movement. Now, in Jaspers, the leap forward becomes the step back, and the confrontation becomes you're looking at the void, but somehow that moment is supposed to include, as Bella suggests, Socrates and Confucius. I mean, he basically wants to make it do Chinese work and work from the Hebrew Bible, specifically the prophets, because he wants to get rid of the law. And it's enormously problematic. And I actually think bringing in the concept of theory as a sort of storage container for every kind of distance from experience is particularly fascinating in light of recent work that's been done comparing ancient theory, the practice of theoria, the journey that's actually taken with darshan. And Ian Rutherford has a new book on that, which is extremely useful. And you know, the thing about the theoretical journey, which is the step away from the received, the native, and so on, is that there are civic theorists and then there are religious theorists. So it's both. So I think you've stated the problem beautifully.
Yes, one last question.
Well, I just wanted to make one comment regarding the Eastern Orthodox Church and the attendance. As the British scholar and Bishop Callistus Ware very clearly indicates in his book, The Orthodox Church, that attendance is really not required, is not traditionally, is not something that is part of the faith. Typically, I'm Eastern Orthodox myself, we tend to go to church twice a year, Christmas and Easter. But it doesn't mean we don't believe, it just means that attendance is not necessarily as frequent as, let's say, in other Christian denominations as Orthodoxy. So that's my comment, but the question I have is, I'm a Jungian analyst myself, so I'm very fascinated with the Freudian
Mhm.
comments here. I'm wondering why Freud, also in his last, before he died, he wrote an essay on Moses. So
Right.
just before he died, he wrote another essay on Moses. And I'm wondering, what do you think was his fascination, even though his break from Jung was a lot about religion, and Jung's fascination with religion, yet he himself seems to be, in a way, there too. So I'm wondering if you could comment on that.
Sure.
Yeah, I just want to reply. I'm Russian Orthodox myself by upbringing. I know CSWR. It's not just church attendance. Incidentally, I disagree with you slightly about that assertion, but it's not just church attendance. You have on standard markers of belief, virgin birth, hell, heaven, I mean, things that are doctrinally central to the Orthodox faith. Russians do not believe at the same rate. In fact, one of my favorite statistics is after the fall of the Soviet Union, the word atheist has a very negative connotation because it's associated with communism, of course. But there was a survey done, and you'll forgive me, I don't recall the exact year, but out of the people who self-identified as atheists, so this is a very discrete group, they're making a political statement by saying this, 43% said they consider themselves to be Orthodox. How do you reconcile that? It's a cultural identity.
Very briefly on Freud, thank you so much for that question. There's a really interesting tradition in modernity of seminal intellectual figures either comparing themselves to Moses or being compared. So Feuerbach says Spinoza is the new Moses. Why does he say that? Well, because if you look at the theological political treatise, you basically have people who are, and I'll speak a little bit crudely, the dupes of priests being, they're in terrible tension, they're being swayed one way or the other, they're easily manipulated. And the idea is that Spinoza, as a Moses-like figure, takes the mob of idolaters and shows them a way forward. And he basically has to take them out of the place they're in and lead them to a different place, namely the democratic state. So the question of whether an Exodus narrative pattern of you're in a state of confusion and manipulation, and then you're in a sort of middle period of deprivation, and then you're in a sort of utopian promised land, is an Exodus narrative inherently secular or inherently religious? It seems to have properties of both. So Freud, I think, is drawing not only from the issues that Adam brought up in the Imago essay and this distancing with the anonymous writing, he's also dealing with a question internal to Judaism about how the way in which Exodus narrative structures can be deployed and what the role of the Moses figure is within that structure.
Great, good. Well, for those of you who are participating in the conference, we have lunch at long last. We have for you down in the conference room, so please feel free to make your way down there. And please let's thank our final panelists and